Cheers, guys. Epix 911, welcome to the Elitist Geek. This is going to be a bit of a somber episode. Leonard Nimoy passed away the other day. And for a lot of guys my age, and I'm 43, Leonard Nimoy and the show Star Trek were easily as important to us in terms of turning us into gamers, sci-fi geeks, computer geeks, as any other show or person. I remember being probably about 10 years old, 9 years old. Actually, it was 10 years old. We'd just come back from Europe, my family, living in Holland. And we were at friends of my parents' house. And they had a tiny little crappy black and white TV. It was maybe 12, 13 inches. You know, tiny little CRT TV. And it was in one of their son's bedrooms. Now, like I said, I was 10. They were probably 13, 14, her sons at the time. And the 13-year-old, you know, used to let us hang out in his bedroom, play with, you know, with his Star Wars toys and look at his comic collection. But I remember we'd go to these people's houses, you know, usually every, I think it was Friday or Saturday that it aired. And it was like a weekly thing. We'd go over there. And I was always looking forward to Star Trek. Star Trek was one of those shows, along with Space 1999 and, of course, Star Wars. See, I never got that whole infighting thing, you know, the Star Trek versus Star Wars. To me, they were equally important. But Star Trek in particular, because it was first, you know, to have a reoccurring show. Star Wars was fantastic. I watched it when I was 5 in the theater, like most guys, you know, and gals of my generation did. But there was something unique about Star Trek being a weekly show. So when I started watching this, it had long been in syndication and rerun. And the storylines were so freaking cool. The whole concept of a ship that didn't have to deal with the politics, you know, of stuff that regular TV shows have to deal with. You know, if it's a cop show, they got to deal with the ins and outs and the rules of that. And sure, there was the Federation, but they were out there specifically to explore. So every week you got to look forward to something cool, something different. Yeah, there were some cheesy ones, you know. The episodes, you know, where they find the alternate Earth type World War II, going through its own World War II history. The time-traveling ones, the Adonis, the god, encountering ones. But for every one of those, there were one or two really, really cool episodes. I wanted this to be off the cuff, so I didn't prepare in terms of extensive notes, because I want it to come from the heart. But I remember one episode in particular in Star Trek was the ones where, well, one of them was where these things fall off the ceiling onto the Federation guys' backs and would take control of them or whatever. I love that one. Spock-centric episodes, probably there were a couple. There was the mating one, where he had to go back after so many years, and the one where there was a planet that basically made the cast members feel you know, polar opposite emotions. So Spock in this episode actually, you know, was consumed with jealousy and envy, which was really, really cool. But Leonard Nimoy was the first sci-fi / fantasy guy, or one of the first. I won't say he was the first, but that looked different. You know, I mean, crap, he was half alien, half human. And a lot of us geeks at the time, like, being a geek wasn't like it is now. I mean, you know, people basically conformed, and whether it was punk rock or computer, you know, arcade gaming, yeah, listening to rock music, you know, there were forms of rebellion, and playing video games at that time wasn't a cool form of rebellion. It was just something that a a lot of us did, but you know, parents didn't get it. A lot of people didn't get it, and it's only now where it's normal for probably a lot of millennials to grow up and have parents or fathers like myself that still game. So you've got, you know, millennial teenagers out there guaranteed that have fathers that probably game with them, and I didn't have that. So my generation is the first generation that can keep a childhood hobby into adulthood and not have it be a bad thing. Prior to that, you know, like my father's generation, it was still the thing to be embarrassed about. You know, you had a model train set. You put on your conductor's hat when everybody was asleep, and you tiptoed into the basement, and you illuminated your train track, and you did your conducting. And that was kind of like your dirty little secret hobby. That's not the case anymore, but it was then. And Leonard Nimoy stood out in that he was totally different, and he had no emotions, and you could live vicariously through that. You know, it got you imagining all kinds of stuff. What is it like to not have emotions? What would it be like to have that strength? Because even though he was only half Vulcan, Vulcans were a lot stronger than humans. You know, your average Vulcan is a lot stronger than your average human. So the incredible strength that Nimoy's character, Spock, had always appealed to me. And his loyalty, you know, his loyalty to his friends. So it's with great sadness, and cheers, Leonard Nimoy. You know, I'm not a religious guy, but your life meant a lot to us. So cheers for that. Much appreciated. On a little bit of a less somber note, but still on the same topic of nostalgia, really, is the whole, you know, continuation of what got me into gaming. And that's what I kind of want to go into now. So, not so much what got me into gaming in general, that's for another episode, but what got me into PC gaming specifically. And I know definitions of PC games, technically an Amiga computer was a PC, and so was an Atari ST, but for the sake of this, let's just use PC as big bad IBM and clones back then, which is what we thought of a PC back in the 80s. I had gone through owning a Commodore 64, which still to this day is my favorite computer of all time. I sold my Commodore 64, you know, with 2 shoeboxes full of games, which was pretty common back then. Selling your game with all the pirated wares, that helped you get the sale. And I purchased an Amiga computer at a store in Canada here called Future Shop. I remember the guy swearing to me, you know, I said, you know, are you guys going to support this if I buy it? Can I come back in here in a year and it's still supported? And they said absolutely. A month later, Future Shop completely stopped carrying Amigas and went PC only. So that kind of pissed me off, but I purchased that Amiga 500 in 1987, and it was the 1988, pardon me, and it was the shit. It was an awesome fucking computer. I loved that Amiga. You know, a lot of the games for us, like you know, Another World, the Shadow of the Beast, they were more tech demos for us than actual games that we played. And we played a lot of games, you know, whether it was the Elite version on the Amiga was fantastic. Suddenly you had, you know, Gorod shaded polygons, and you know, Road Radar was a fantastic game. There were so many good games for the Amiga, but I'll tell you, I remember exactly when I started eyeing the other woman, and that was the PC. Now, to put this into context, the Amiga computer at the time had 4096 color palette, all right? A Commodore 64 had 16 colors. Commodore 64 game could use up to 16 colors, but it could only use the 16 colors that the machine came with. So a lot of the colors that we associate with Commodore 64 games and programs were really part and parcel of what Commodore represented. I mean, those colors are, you know, I can specifically recall the exact brown, the orange, etc. the Amiga was more powerful. It had a palette of 4,096 colors. But most games were 16 colors, right? Slightly higher resolution than the Commodore 64. It was a 320 by 200 resolution, I believe, on the Amiga, drawing from those 4,096 colors. Now, you could use more. For example, and this is where it comes into the games that that first made me kind of start looking at the PC, was the first of those games would have been King's Quest. King's Quest 5, I believe, yeah, King's Quest 5, which for the PC owners that had a VGA card was 256 color. And if you saw EGA King's Quest 5 versus VGA King's Quest 5, there was no comparison. Absolutely freaking gorgeous in 256 colors. Now, the Amiga version was a horribly bad port. It could have ran much faster, but it was a very procedural language. They used this engine for the King's Quest games, Sierra did, that it was almost like a translation language instead of a raw programming in assembly or C++. And as a result, it was slow on the Amiga. But rather than go with the mainstream 16-color mode that most Amiga games were, they opted to go with a 32-color mode. And there were some pitfalls in programming to using that 32-color mode. Speed is obviously one of them. So along with it being a bad port and suffering from the game engine porting slowly, you also had to deal with a 32-color mode, which made some sacrifices. Now, there was also a 64-color mode, which was basically called extra half-bright mode. And what that did is, I think it was, so you had your 32 colors, and extra half-bright basically just had another set of 32 colors that were half as bright as the first 32. So picture it like this. If you had, black, bright red, bright green for your first 32, your second 32 would have a medium green, medium blue, right? That's kind of how it worked. I believe there were some games, maybe one or two, that used extra half-bright mode, but yeah, very, very rare that games used the 64 colors, half-bright mode. No games used what was called ham mode, which was hold and modify, where basically 4,096, that 4,096 color palette I was telling you guys about, could be used at one time. But it involved all kinds of hardware tricks. It was super demanding. It was basically just for static images, aka porn. And I joke about that, but it was true. Most people used ham mode on the Amiga to look at porn pics, because you suddenly went from really horrible digitized pics on the Commodore 64 to almost photo-like Amiga porn pictures. So there you have it. So most games were in 16 color though. Anyways, King's Quest was 256 colors, and I looked at that thing and I bought the 32 color Amiga version. It was slow, it was horrible, and I just blamed it on a bad port. I was still super staunch pro Amiga, an elitist gamer really, and that's the whole point of my channel, is at one time I was very elitist and into the whole console computer war thing. Amigas were superior as far as I was concerned. And sound-wise, it took a long time for the PCs to catch up. Probably, I would say, until the mid-90s with the Sound Blaster 16 before it was really on par with what the Amiga could do. Because the PC speaker sound, sure as shit wasn't cutting it. Neither was the horrible ad-lib sound card at that time. They were much better than PC speaker, but it was no Amiga. But the graphics, no fucking contest. The PC, by the time King's Quest V was released, didn't let up. It was a fucking avalanche of gorgeous VGA titles. Secret of Monkey Island, Ultima 6, the game Ultima 6 that finally made me secretly, at least inside, I still wasn't ready to proclaim it to the world, acknowledge the power of a PC, because Ultima 6 port was even worse than the King's Quest port. It crawled. It took forever to even just walk through a fucking town. And it was 16 color, and it was horrible compared to the luscious 256 color VGA PC version of Ultima 6, which was also way faster. But the game, or set of games, was Wing Commander, which came out a little later that summer, I believe September of 1990. Wing Commander pretty much nailed it shut, and my friends and I were now actively talking about upgrading in the near future, because Wing Commander was beautiful. It was fast, frantic, awesome space action. But the ads at that time that really caught my imagination, the game had not been released yet, were ads for a game called Ultima Underworld, which was advertised as true 3D. You got to remember, we were coming from wireframe and simple Gorod shaded polygons. The promise of Ultima Underworld was a fully realized 3D world with bitmap sprite monsters that looked fantastic, multiple levels, and an RPG that you could really sink your teeth into. I was sold. By the time Ultima Underworld was released, which was in March, I basically threw all my bingo chips in and said, fuck it. Me and my buddy, we sold our Amigas, we bought PCs, we both bought the exact same 386 DX40 with 4 megs of RAM, 105 megabyte hard drive, with a Trident VGA card inside, but no sound card. Yes, we actually played on PC speakers for the first few months until we could afford a Sound Blaster card. But the games that we immediately bought were Wing Commander, Ultima 6, Ultima Underworld, and the game that came out a month before we actually sold our system, Wolfenstein 3D, which I argue that after Wolfenstein 3D was released, those people who held on to their Amigas were simply just being stubborn, or weren't gamers. Because if at that point in time you hadn't contemplated or actually sold your Amiga for a PC, you were just, you were basically going down with the ship, because there was not much of a future, even though the Amiga ended up getting an AGA chipset. And I know, I get that, people. Yes, it did. The writing was already on the wall, and a couple years later, Commodore, unfortunately, filed for bankruptcy. And while I feel bad, I kind of liken it to the Amiga was like my wife, and things had kind of, not my real life wife, but at the time, right? Things had kind of gotten stale and predictable in the marriage. And the PC, when it came along, wow, she was the vixen of an affair, girlfriend / mistress on the side that you were really excited about. And eventually I got her, and then married her. So there's a bit of background on how I got into the PC. Curious how you guys got into PC gaming, the guys that are as old as me. For you young guys, you probably grew up with computers, and it's a moot point. The only real alternative out there is Apple right now, but still interested in hearing. Consoles, same thing. I'll talk about that another day. Once again, rest in peace, Leonard. And the rest of you, as always, cheers.